My brother announced I had been cut out of Grandpa's will before the funeral flowers had even started to wilt. He set it at the front of the chapel, with one hand resting on the polished casket, and the other holding a cream envelope like it was a trophy. Everyone turned to look at me. I did not cry. I did not argue. And that silence was the reason they all thought I had already lost. My name is Clara Whitmore. I'm 34 years old, and I work as a probate paralegal in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That means I spend my days reading the kind of documents most families only think about when somebody dies, and everybody suddenly remembers they loved the person with money. I know what a proper will looks like. I know what a rushed signature looks like. And I know the sound a room makes when greed tries to dress itself up as grief. Grandpa's funeral was held at Maple Ridge Chapel, the same white church where he had taken me every Easter when I was little. The pews smelled like old wood polish and lilies. His fishing hat sat beside the guest book, because I had placed it there that morning, tucked just under the framed photograph of him laughing by the river. My brother Mason moved it 2 inches to the left when he arrived, like even Grandpa's hat had to obey him. Mason was 40 expensive in the way insecure men try to be expensive. Navy suit, silver watch, shoes that clicked too loudly on church floors. He hugged relatives with one arm and checked who was watching over their shoulders. His wife, Betrayal, stood beside him in black silk, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. They both looked devastated in the way people look devastated when they want credit for showing up. I stood in the second row, hands folded around the small brass key Grandpa had given me 3 nights before he died. It was warm from my palm, and heavier than it should have been. Mason's eyes dropped to it once, then rose back to my face with that familiar little smile. The one that said, "I know something you don't." The sad part was he had been smiling at me like that since we were children. In our family, Mason was the son who carried the name forward. I was the daughter who carried the groceries, the medicine list, the birthday reminders, the apology phone calls, and eventually Grandpa himself. When Mom died, Mason inherited her praise. I inherited her responsibilities. Dad called it natural because I was better with people. Mason called it fair because he had bigger things to build. Grandpa called it what it was, but only when the two of us were alone. For the last 4 years of Grandpa's life, I drove from Cedar Rapids to his farmhouse in Millhaven every weekend, sometimes twice a week. I cleaned gutters, sorted pills into plastic boxes, fought insurance bills, learned how he liked his oatmeal after his stroke, changed his taste, and sat with him through the long winter evenings when his hands shook too badly to hold a book. Mason visited on holidays with loud stories and store-bought pie. Then he posted pictures online captioned, "Family first." Grandpa never complained in front of Mason. That was one of the things that made people underestimate him. He had been a county judge for 32 years before retirement, and he had a way of letting people talk themselves into the truth. He would sit in his recliner plaid blanket over his knees listening to Mason explain investments, development deals, tax strategy, family duty. Then Grandpa would glance at me afterward and say, "Your brother uses 10 words when 2 would reveal too much." 3 weeks before the funeral, Grandpa asked me to drive him to First Hawthorne Bank. He wore his brown coat even though it was warm, and he insisted on shaving first. At the bank he met privately with Mr. Patel, the manager, while I waited near a fake plant and pretended not to notice Mason's name on a folder inside Grandpa's leather satchel. When Grandpa came out, he looked exhausted but peaceful. He handed me the brass key in the parking lot and closed my fingers around it. "Clara," he said, "when the noise starts, don't try to shout over it." I asked him what noise. He smiled at me, tired and sad, and said, "The kind people make when they are afraid the truth has finally learned their address." Then he made me promise something that felt unfair even before I understood it. He made me promise that I would not defend myself at the first accusation. Not in the chapel. Not in front of family. Not until the right person opened the right envelope. That promise sat inside me like a stone during the funeral. It sat there while Aunt Denise kissed Mason's cheek and told him he had always been Grandpa's pride. It sat there while Cousin Lyle squeezed my shoulder and whispered that it must have been hard being left out of the important decisions. It sat there while Brielle walked past me and murmured, not quietly enough, "At least now, everyone can stop pretending Clara was the favorite." The service began with a hymn Grandpa used to hum off-key. Reverend Collins spoke about humility, justice, and the way Grandpa had believed every person deserved to be heard. I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny, but because Mason was sitting directly in front of me, preparing to prove he had never listened to a word Grandpa said. His shoulders were squared, his jaw was lifted. He was waiting for his moment. It came after the final prayer, when people were supposed to stand and follow the casket out. Mason stepped into the aisle instead. He touched the top of the coffin like a son in mourning, but his fingers barely rested there. He cleared his throat. Reverend Collins looked startled. Brielle lowered her eyes with practiced sorrow. And before anyone could stop him, Mason raised the cream envelope and said, "Before we leave, there is something Grandpa wanted the family to know." The chapel went still. Even the organist froze with her hands hovering over the keys. Mason turned toward the pews, his face arranged into solemn duty. He said Grandpa had updated his will. He said Grandpa had finally recognized who had been responsible, who had carried the family name, who had kept the Whitmore legacy intact. Then he looked directly at me and said Clara was removed. Completely. I know this may be painful, but Grandpa believed fairness mattered more than sentiment. Fairness. That was Mason's favorite word when he wanted something that belonged to someone else. He had used it when he convinced Dad to co-sign his first failed business loan. He had used it when he took Mom's car after she died because I didn't need anything that nice. He had used it when Grandpa's farmhouse needed repairs, and Mason said my weekends counted as my contribution, while his opinions counted as leadership. Fairness in Mason's mouth always meant someone else paying. A low sound moved through the chapel, not a gasp exactly, more like satisfaction pretending to be sympathy. Aunt Denise pressed a hand to her chest. Cousin Lyle stared at his shoes. Someone behind me whispered. After all that time she spent over there, someone else whispered back. Maybe he knew something. That was how fast a lifetime of caregiving could be rewritten by one confident man with an envelope. I felt my throat tighten, but I kept my face still. My fingers stayed around the brass key. Grandpa's promise rang in my head so clearly I could almost hear his voice from the front row. Don't shout over the noise. I looked at Mason, at the envelope in his hand, at Brielle's small, victorious smile. Then I looked at Grandpa's casket and remembered the last thing he had told me in his kitchen while the kettle hissed behind him. He had said, "Silence is not the same as surrender, Clara. Sometimes silence is how you let a liar finish building his own cage." Mason waited for me to react. I knew he wanted tears. He wanted me to stand up and deny it, to look unstable in front of everyone, to make his announcement seem dignified by comparison. When I did nothing, his expression flickered. Just once. It was small enough that most people missed it, but I had spent years reading documents and men like Mason. Confidence hates silence when it expects begging. Reverend Collins stepped toward him and said softly, "Mason, perhaps this should wait." Mason shook his head, still looking at me. "No, Reverend. Grandpa believed in honesty. Clara should hear this with the family present." That was the sentence that cut deepest. Not because it was cruel, though it was. Because for 1 second the girl inside me who had wanted her brother to love her still wondered what I had done to deserve being punished at a funeral. Then the side door of the chapel opened. Judge Evelyn Harrow walked in wearing a plain black dress and carrying a flat leather folder against her chest. She had been Grandpa's closest friend from the courthouse days, a woman with silver hair, sharp eyes, and the kind of quiet presence that made dishonest people lower their voices. She had not been seated with the family because she had arrived late on purpose. I knew that the moment I saw the second cream envelope in her hand. Mason saw it too. His smile thinned. Judge Harrow walked down the aisle slowly, every heel strike landing in the silence Mason had created. She stopped beside Grandpa's casket, nodded once to Reverend Collins, and turned toward my brother. "Mason," she said, "that is not the final document." Her voice was calm, but it carried to the back wall. "And before this family leaves this chapel, your grandfather asked me to open the second envelope." Judge Harrow did not ask Mason for permission. She did not look around to see whether the family approved. She simply placed her leather folder on the small table beside Grandpa's photograph and set the second cream envelope on top of it. The envelope was sealed with red wax pressed with Grandpa's old judicial stamp. I heard Aunt Denise suck in a breath behind me because everyone in our family knew that stamp. Grandpa only used it when he wanted something to be impossible to dismiss. Mason's hand tightened around his own envelope. "Evelyn," he said with the careful politeness of a man trying not to look frightened, "this really isn't appropriate. The family is grieving." Judge Harrow looked at him over the rim of her glasses. "Then I suggest you stop performing and let your grandfather speak." The chapel went so quiet that I could hear Brielle's bracelet shift against her wrist. Mason opened his mouth, then closed it again. Judge Harrow turned toward the congregation. For clarity, she said, I am not here as a judge today. I am here as a witness, a former colleague, and the person Samuel Whitmore asked to hold this envelope until after Mason Whitmore made his announcement. That sentence hit the room like a dropped plate. Several heads turned toward Mason. He forced a laugh that had no warmth in it. That's ridiculous. Grandpa wouldn't stage something at his own funeral. He did not stage anything, Judge Harrow said. He prepared for you. I felt the brass key bite into my palm. Prepared for you. Not prepared for death. Not prepared for taxes or probate or mourning. Prepared for Mason. Grandpa had known. Maybe he had always known. My chest ached with a grief so sharp I had to lower my eyes. It is one thing to understand someone loves you. It is another thing to realize they saw the trap before you did and spent their last strength building you a door out. Judge Harrow did not open the envelope immediately. She picked up Mason's document first. May I? She asked. It was not really a question. Mason hesitated just long enough for everyone to see it, then handed it over. She read the first page with no expression. Then the second. Then she looked at the signature block and lifted one eyebrow. This document is dated March 11th of this year, she said. 2 days after Samuel was released from the hospital after a minor stroke. Betrayal stepped forward before Mason could stop her. He was perfectly lucid, she said too quickly. Mason visited him that afternoon. Samuel knew exactly what he was doing. Judge Harrow looked at her. Interesting. I did not ask. A few people shifted in the pews. Betrayal's cheeks flushed under her makeup. Mason touched her elbow, a silent warning, then faced the room with a wounded expression. This is exactly why I wanted the family to know. Clara always made Grandpa suspicious of me. That was the first lie that truly hurt. Not because it was convincing, but because it was familiar. Mason had spent years turning consequences into my personality. If Grandpa asked where the missing checks went, Mason said I had made him paranoid. If Grandpa refused to invest in another one of Mason's projects, Mason said I had poisoned him against ambition. If I changed Grandpa's pharmacy because Mason forgot refills 3 times, Mason said I loved control. He never apologized. He translated. Judge Harrow held up the first document. According to this will, Mason receives the farmhouse, the savings account, the antique truck, the fishing cabin, and all personal property not otherwise specified. Clara receives nothing. Aunt Denise made a small pitying sound. I looked straight ahead. I could feel their eyes moving between me and Mason like a tennis match. They wanted my face to tell them whether the paper was true. I gave them nothing. Mason's confidence returned a little. Grandpa made his choice, he said. I didn't write it for him. Judge Harrow placed the document down. No. But you brought a notary from your office. You were the only family member present. And you failed to mention that Samuel had already signed a prior estate plan naming Clara as his medical and financial agent years before. Mason's jaw worked once. That doesn't matter. A newer will replaces an older one. Sometimes, she said. That one word changed the air. I remembered the week after Grandpa's stroke. Mason had come to the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon, unusual enough that Mrs. Bell from next door called me. I was at work halfway through assembling probate filings when she said Mason's SUV had been in the driveway for nearly 2 hours. When I arrived, Grandpa was pale and furious, sitting at the kitchen table with a pen lying beside him. Mason had left 10 minutes earlier. Grandpa told me not to ask questions that night. He said he was tired. He said he wanted tomato soup, then barely touched it. On the counter I saw a legal pad with indentations from writing as if someone had pressed hard on the page above it. I did not know then that he had signed anything. I only knew that when I reached for his hand he squeezed mine and whispered, "Some people mistake weakness for an open door." The next morning I found 3 things in the trash under coffee grounds: a torn appointment card from Hawthorne Mobile Notary, a carbon copy receipt from Mason's real estate office, and a sticky note in Betrayal's handwriting that said, "Make sure he signs before Clara gets here." I dried the coffee from the paper with paper towels and tucked it into a freezer bag because that is what years of legal work teaches you. You do not always understand evidence when you find it. You preserve it anyway. But I still did not confront Mason. That was what people never understood about silence. They thought it meant fear. Sometimes it meant you were building a timeline. Sometimes it meant you knew rage would only warn the person who needed to remain careless. So I documented quietly. I took photographs of the notary receipt. I called Hawthorne's office, and confirmed the appointment had been booked by Mason's assistant. I wrote down the date Grandpa asked me to take him to First Hawthorne Bank. At the time, I thought I was protecting Grandpa while he was alive. I did not realize he was protecting me for afterward. Judge Harrow slid her finger beneath the wax seal of the second envelope. The crack sounded tiny, but half the room flinched. Mason took one step closer. "You can't just read private papers at a funeral." Judge Harrow paused. "You announced a will at a funeral." He looked around as if searching for support. No one spoke. Even the people who had always rushed to soften his embarrassment seemed unsure which version of him was safest to believe now. Inside the envelope were several folded pages and a small handwritten note. Judge Harrow unfolded the note first. I recognized Grandpa's handwriting, immediately slanted and firm even after his stroke. My knees nearly softened. There is something unbearable about seeing a dead person's handwriting in a room full of people who have been arguing over what he wanted. It feels like the dead have reached back through the dirt and placed one steady hand on the table. Judge Harrow read, "If Mason chooses decency, this envelope may remain private. If he uses my funeral to humiliate Clara, open it in front of the family. Let them hear the reason she stayed silent." Brielle's hand flew to her mouth. Mason's face turned a hard, flat white. Aunt Denise whispered, "Oh my God." I closed my eyes for 1 second because Grandpa had known the exact shape of Mason's cruelty. He had known Mason would not choose decency. The letter continued. "Clara promised me she would not defend herself against Mason's first claim. I asked this of her because Mason has spent his life demanding emotional reactions and then using those reactions as proof. I will not let him do that to her at my funeral." My breath trembled once. I hated that he had been right. I hated that even in death he had to manage the damage Mason caused. But under that pain was something stronger. Relief. Somebody had seen it. Mason tried to interrupt. "This is manipulation." He was angry because Judge Harrow lifted a hand. "Do not speak over him." There was no anger in her voice. That made it more powerful. Mason stopped, humiliated by the simple fact that for once, the room did not bend toward his comfort. Judge Harrow looked back at the letter and continued. "The document Mason holds was signed under pressure during a vulnerable medical period. I do not consider it an expression of my free intent." A murmur broke through the chapel. Mason spun toward the family. "He was fine. Ask anyone. He was walking. He was talking. Clara wants you to think he was helpless because she can't accept that he finally saw her for what she is." There it was, the anchor, the sentence he had been waiting to say. He pointed at me in front of Grandpa's casket and said, "She was never loyal. She was just patient enough to get paid." For a moment the room blurred. Not because I believed him, because some sentences are designed to hit the oldest bruise. I remembered being 16 working at the grocery store after school while Mason played baseball and Dad told me to be proud of my brother. I remembered paying Grandpa's electric bill from my own account, when Mason forgot to transfer money he had promised. I remembered sleeping in a recliner beside Grandpa, after his fall, waking every hour to make sure he was breathing. Patient enough to get paid. That was what he called love when he could not control it. Judge Harrow let the accusation hang. Then she pulled another paper from the envelope. Samuel anticipated that claim as well. Mason stared at her. She unfolded the page and read, "For the record, Clara refused payment for caregiving 11 times. I offered monthly compensation beginning in 2021. She refused. I offered reimbursement for fuel groceries and missed work. She refused unless the expense was directly mine. Enclosed is my ledger of those offers and her refusals." Aunt Denise turned toward me with a face I could not read. Cousin Lyle looked sick. Brielle's eyes narrowed, calculating damage. Judge Harrow removed a photocopied ledger from the folder, each line written in Grandpa's careful hand. Date, offer, amount, Clara's response. Some of them included tiny notes. Said she was my granddaughter, not my employee. Told me to buy better coffee instead. Refused again, stubborn as her grandmother. The room was reading my love in numbers I had never asked anyone to count. That was when I realized the funeral had stopped being a funeral. It had become a courtroom without a bench, and Mason had walked himself to the witness stand. Judge Harrow had not even reached the final page. The second envelope still held something else, something thicker folded behind Grandpa's letter. Mason saw her reach for it and the panic finally broke through his face. Not grief, not anger, panic. Mason, Judge Harrow said before I read the revised will, I need to ask you one question your grandfather wrote for you. She looked directly at him. Where is the key to the blue lockbox from the farmhouse pantry? My hand closed tighter around the brass key in my palm. Mason's eyes flicked to it before he could stop himself. Everyone saw. Judge Harrow followed his gaze to me, then back to him. I see, she said. So he was right about that too. I had carried that key through the entire service without understanding how much weight it truly held. Grandpa had given it to me in a bank parking lot with shaking fingers and a strange calm in his eyes. I thought it opened a lockbox with family photographs or old bonds, maybe the kind of sentimental things he did not trust Mason to throw away. But when Judge Harrow asked Mason where that lockbox key was, the whole story shifted. It was no longer about who loved Grandpa. It was about who had tried to bury him before he was dead. Mason recovered quickly because men like my brother practice recovery more than honesty. He straightened his jacket and said, I don't know anything about a lockbox. But his eyes had already betrayed him. They had gone to my hand, to the brass key, to the one object in the room he wished I would hide. I held it a little higher without meaning to. The chapel watched the tiny movement, and for the first time that day, the silence belonged to me. Judge Harrow looked at Reverend Collins. Samuel asked that the lockbox be brought here if Mason disputed the contents of this envelope. Reverend Collins nodded slowly, as if he had been carrying his own part of Grandpa's plan and hating it. He walked into the small office behind the pulpit and returned with a blue metal box, chipped at the corners with a strip of masking tape on the top. In Grandpa's handwriting, it said only, after the first lie. Aunt Denise covered her mouth. Mason took one step back. Betrayal whispered something to him too low for most people to hear, but I caught the edge of it. Stop this now. That was when I knew she knew more than she had pretended. She was not shocked by the lockbox. She was shocked it had reached the chapel. Her eyes did not look confused. They looked trapped. I had seen that expression on people in conference rooms when a missing page suddenly appeared. Judge Harrow turned to me. Clara, Samuel asked that you open it. My feet did not move at first. There are moments when the body refuses to understand that a lifetime has changed its shape. I walked to the front of the chapel with every eye on my back. Mason had made that walk feel like public punishment minutes earlier. Now each step felt like crossing a line he had drawn years ago and finally seeing it dissolve under my shoes. The key slid into the lock with a small click. That sound was softer than Mason's announcement, softer than Betrayal's whisper, softer than Aunt Denise's gasp. But it did more damage. The lid lifted, and inside were 4 labeled folders, a flash drive, a bundle of receipts, and one old photograph of Grandpa and me on his porch when I was 8, both of us holding fishing rods and laughing at something outside the frame. On the back he had written, "She stayed because she loved me." I stared at that sentence until the words blurred. Judge Harrow gently touched my elbow, not to rush me but to remind me I was not standing there alone. I handed her the first folder. Its label read, March 11. She opened it and removed the torn appointment card I had found in the trash, still sealed in the freezer bag where I had placed it. Beside it was the mobile notary receipt, the carbon copy from Mason's office, and Betrayal's sticky note. Mason barked out a laugh. Trash, that's what we're doing now. Clara went through trash and built a conspiracy. His voice was louder than before but less controlled. Judge Harrow did not answer him. She laid the items on the table in a neat line. Samuel found these after Clara preserved them, she said. He asked Mr. Patel to copy them, date them, and store duplicates at the bank. He also filed a written complaint with the Iowa Notary Board before his final hospitalization. That was new. I had not known Grandpa filed anything. I had given him the bag and told him quietly what I found, expecting him to be angry. Instead, he had sat at the kitchen table for a long time, turning the freezer bag over in his hands. Then he had asked me to make tea. He said nothing about complaints, nothing about copies, nothing about a plan. He had let me believe I was taking care of him while he was still taking care of me. Judge Harrow opened the next folder. The label read, Capacity. Inside was a physician's letter from Dr. Elaine Porter, dated 2 days after Mason's document. The letter stated that Grandpa had been medically stable but vulnerable to fatigue, confusion under pressure, and impaired decision-making during prolonged, stressful conversations. It did not say he was incapable of signing anything. It said he should not have been isolated with interested parties during legal decisions. That distinction mattered. In probate, details are not decoration. They are doors. Mason seized on it immediately. So he was capable, he said. Thank you. That proves my point. Judge Harrow looked at him for a long moment. It proves you knew exactly which window to use. Several people shifted again. This time not away from me. Away from him. That small movement did something to Mason's face. He was used to being forgiven before he finished explaining. He was not used to a room quietly deciding he might be the danger. Betrayal stepped beside him, chin lifted. Samuel wanted Mason to have the property because Mason has a family. Clara doesn't even have children. What was she going to do with a farmhouse? The sentence landed with the kind of cruelty people pretend is practicality. I felt it, but it did not knock me down. Grandpa had asked me once if loneliness felt worse when others used it against me. I told him not always. Sometimes it only proved they had run out of better weapons. Judge Harrow removed the third folder. Property offers. Samuel anticipated that argument too. She read from the page. Grandpa had written that Mason had approached him 3 separate times about selling the farmhouse acreage to a developer connected to Betrayal's cousin. The offer was below market value, structured through a shell company, and included a proposed consulting fee to Mason. The room grew heavier with every sentence. This was not inheritance. This was strategy. Grandpa's land had not been a memory to Mason, it had been inventory. Mason's face hardened. That land was rotting. I had a plan to turn it into something profitable. I finally spoke quietly before I could stop myself. Grandpa's orchard was not rotting. Every head turned to me. My voice sounded strange in the chapel, calm but rough from holding back too much. Mason looked relieved for half a second, like he had finally pulled me into the fight. I remembered Grandpa's warning and said nothing else. But Judge Harrow smiled faintly, not at Mason, at me. Samuel wrote that Clara would say that. She lifted a page and read, "If Clara speaks today, she will probably defend the orchard before she defends herself. That is why she should have it." My throat closed. Mason's jaw dropped slightly, not from grief but from offense. He could not stand that Grandpa knew me in a way Mason had never bothered to. He could not stand that love had left paperwork. The fourth folder was labeled Contact Log. It contained printed phone records, emails, and copies of text messages Mason had sent Grandpa. Some were ordinary, some were not. One text said, "Clara is confusing you because she wants control." Another said, "If you don't fix the will now, this family will fall apart and it will be on you." Another sent, the morning of March 11, said, "I'm bringing someone by. Don't tell Clara. She'll make drama." The last line moved through the chapel like cold air. "Don't tell Clara. She'll make drama." That was the family script in 4 words. I was drama when I noticed. Drama when I remembered. Drama when I kept receipts. Drama when I refused to pretend neglect was tradition. Mason had not invented that script alone. He had inherited it from every relative who preferred my silence because it kept their holidays comfortable. Aunt Denise started crying then. Not loudly. Not the kind of tears that ask for attention. She looked at the papers on the table, and then at me, as if she was seeing a house she had driven past for years and only now realized someone had been locked inside. "Clara," she whispered, "why didn't you tell us?" I wanted to laugh, but I was too tired. "Because you never asked. Because when I tried you called it jealousy. Because Mason sounded more useful to believe." I did not say any of that. I only looked at the lockbox. Mason pointed at Judge Harrow. "This is character assassination." His voice cracked on the last word. Grandpa was old. He was bitter. Clara fed him stories, and now all of you are letting her use a funeral to steal everything. Judge Harrow closed the folder slowly. "Mason, your grandfather gave you a chance to avoid this. He wrote that if you allowed his funeral to remain a funeral, the family would receive only the revised will through normal probate channels. You chose the public version." That sentence was the first real consequence Mason had ever met in front of witnesses. He looked around the chapel, searching for the old arrangement. Someone to soothe him, someone to scold me, someone to say family meant moving on. Nobody moved. Even Betrayal looked less certain now, her hand frozen at the crook of his elbow. Mason had built his life around the belief that if he spoke first loudest and with enough wounded dignity, people would call that truth. Judge Harrow picked up the flash drive from the lockbox but did not plug it in. Instead, she set it beside Grandpa's letter. "This contains Samuel's recorded statement from April 2nd, made at First Hawthorne Bank with Mr. Patel and myself present." Mason went completely still. I did too. Grandpa had recorded a statement. The last week of his life, he could barely climb the porch steps without stopping, but he had gone to a bank, he had sat under fluorescent lights and preserved his voice. Judge Harrow continued. It will be submitted with the estate file. It explains why he revoked the March document, why he created a new will, and why he asked Clara not to respond when accused. She looked toward the back of the chapel, where two men in dark suits had entered quietly. One was Mr. Patel. The other was a court clerk I recognized from the county building. The world tilted slightly. Grandpa had not left a surprise. He had left a procedure. Mason saw them and understood before most of the room did. This was not a family argument anymore. This was a record, a chain of custody, witnesses, dates, documents. The things he had always dismissed as Clara's little office habits were now the walls closing around him. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time in my life, my brother had nothing ready. Judge Harrow lifted the final folded document from the second envelope. Now, she said, we will read Samuel Whitmore's last valid will and testament. My hand still rested on the blue lockbox beside the photograph of Grandpa and me on the porch. Mason stood 3 feet away, pale and rigid. Every lie he had told about loyalty, fairness, and family sat exposed between us. And then Judge Harrow broke the seal on the document that would decide what silence had been protecting. Judge Harrow unfolded Grandpa's final will with the same care she might have used to handle a fragile photograph. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. Even Mason seemed afraid to breathe too loudly, as if sound itself could change the words already printed on the page. I stood beside the blue lockbox with my fingertips resting on the chipped metal lid, and for the first time since Grandpa died, I felt the floor beneath me again. Not safe exactly, just solid. She began with the formal language, his full name, his county, his declaration that he was of sound mind and acting voluntarily. Then she reached the part everyone had come to hear. The farmhouse, orchard, fishing cabin, antique truck, personal letters, and all family photographs were left to me. Not because I was owed payment, not because I had earned love through service, because in Grandpa's words I had protected what Mason tried to convert into cash. A sound came from Mason's throat, low and disbelieving. No, it was not grief, it was ownership being challenged. Judge Harrow continued without looking at him. Grandpa left modest cash gifts to several relatives, donations to the county legal aid fund, and a small scholarship at the community college for students caring for elderly family members while working part-time. That detail nearly broke me. Even at the end, he was thinking about people nobody applauded until they collapsed. Then came Mason's name. Judge Harrow paused just long enough for the room to lean forward. To my grandson, Mason Whitmore, I leave $1 and the opportunity to tell the truth before someone else has to do it for him. The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Mason's face twisted. Brielle stepped back from him by half an inch, a tiny movement, but I noticed. People always step away from a fire once they realize it can spread to them. Mason pointed at the document. That's not legal. He can't just punish me because Clara manipulated him. Judge Harrow closed the will halfway and looked directly at him. He did not punish you. He documented you. Mr. Patel moved to the front, then carrying a slim laptop case. Reverend Collins placed a small speaker on the table beside Grandpa's photograph. I watched Mason understand the next part before it happened. The dead man's handwriting had been bad enough. His voice would be worse. Judge Harrow looked at me before pressing play. Clara, Samuel wanted you to know you do not have to stay for this. I thought about leaving. For 1 second I imagined stepping out into the cold chapel hallway, sitting beneath the coat hooks, and letting other people carry the ugliness for once. But then I looked at Mason still standing near Grandpa's casket as if he had the right to occupy the center of every pain he caused. I stayed. Grandpa's voice filled the chapel, thinner than I remembered but unmistakably his. My name is Samuel Whitmore. It is April 2nd. Present are Evelyn Harrow and Raj Patel. I am recording this because my grandson Mason has attempted to pressure me into leaving him property he intends to sell through an arrangement that benefits him personally. Someone behind me whispered, Jesus. Mason shook his head, but he did not speak. He could not argue with a voice from the grave without looking monstrous. Grandpa continued. Clara has not asked me for the farmhouse money repayment or advantage. She has asked me to sleep, take my medicine, stop eating bacon twice a day, and call her if I feel dizzy. I asked her to stay silent if Mason attacked her after my death, because I wanted the family to see the difference between someone defending property and someone defending dignity. My mouth trembled. I pressed my lips together until the feeling passed. The recording did not make Grandpa sound dramatic. That was what made it devastating. He spoke plainly with pauses for breath-naming dates, conversations, and documents. He said Mason had told him Clara would die alone in that farmhouse and waste it. He said Betrayal had called the orchard sentimental dirt. He said the March will was signed after 2 hours of pressure, while he was tired, medicated, and afraid that refusing would make Mason cut him off from the rest of the family. Betrayal started crying then, but they were not the same tears Aunt Denise had cried. Hers were quick, sharp, defensive tears. We were trying to help, she said. That property needed a future. Mr. Patel stopped the recording and looked at her with polite disbelief. Mrs. Whitmore, the offer your cousin made was 40% below the independent appraisal. Betrayal's tears vanished for a second. Mason turned on her with his eyes alone. Their partnership had reached the part where blame began looking for a new address. Judge Harrow resumed the recording. Grandpa's voice softened. If this is being played, then Mason chose to use my funeral to shame Clara. I am sorry, sweetheart. I asked too much of you. But I needed them to see what he does when he thinks nobody has kept a record. That was the moment I cried. Not loudly. A few tears slipped down and I let them. Mason had wanted tears as proof I was weak. Grandpa had turned them into proof I had survived. When the recording ended, the chapel remained silent. Not the stunned silence from before. This one had weight. It carried every ignored weekend, every unpaid grocery receipt, every fake family photo Mason had posted every time someone called me sensitive because I noticed cruelty before they were ready to admit it. Aunt Denise stood first. She walked past Mason without touching him and came to me. I'm sorry, she whispered. It was not enough. But for once it was not nothing. Mason grabbed his envelope from the table. This isn't over. His voice had lost its audience warmth. It was raw, now stripped to entitlement. I'll contest it. I'll drag this through court until there's nothing left. I wiped my cheek with my thumb and looked at him. My voice was quiet, steadier than I expected. Then you'll do it against the bank copies, the witness statements, the medical letter, the notary complaint, the appraisal, and Grandpa's recording. I paused. That's your choice. He stared at me like I had spoken a language he did not believe I knew. For years he had mistaken my restraint for lack of power. But power is not always loud. Sometimes it is a freezer bag with coffee-stained paper inside. Sometimes it is a ledger kept by an old man who loved you. Sometimes it is the decision not to save someone from the consequences they personally walked toward with both eyes open. Betrayal tried one last version of family. Clara, please. You don't want to destroy your brother. There it was, dressed softer now. The old trap. If I protected myself, I was destroying him. If I told the truth, I was cruel. If I refused to absorb the damage quietly, I was the reason the family broke. I looked at her, then at Mason, and said the sentence I should have learned years earlier. I am not destroying him. I am declining to hide him. After that, things happened with a strange calm. The casket was carried out. People followed in uneven groups, not knowing who to stand beside. Mason left before the graveside prayer, Betrayal hurrying after him in heels that sank into the chapel lawn. I stayed by Grandpa's grave until the final handful of dirt struck the lid below. Judge Harrow stood beside me silent. When the others walked away, she handed me the photograph from the lockbox. Probate did come. Mason filed objections exactly as promised. He hired a loud attorney who sent letters full of phrases like undue influence and questionable motives. But documents do not care who sounds offended. The March will collapsed under the complaint, the records, the witnesses, and the fact that Grandpa had created his final estate plan with more clarity than Mason had expected from a man he underestimated. The notary faced disciplinary review. The development offer disappeared once reporters heard whispers of elder pressure. I did not become rich. That is not what this story is about. The farmhouse needed a new roof, the orchard needed pruning, and the antique truck still coughed like it resented mornings. But I kept it. I kept the porch where Grandpa taught me to shell peas. I kept the pantry where the blue lockbox had been hidden. I kept the fishing cabin with his old tackle box, still smelling faintly of metal lake water and peppermint candies. Mason called me twice after the estate settled. I did not answer. Then he sent a message that said, Grandpa turned you against me. I read it while standing under the apple tree's late September sun cutting through the branches. I typed 3 words, then deleted them. He did not need another explanation to twist. He did not need another doorway into my peace. So I blocked his number and slid the phone back into my pocket. Aunt Denise visits sometimes now. She brings pie and awkward apologies that arrive in pieces never perfectly, but honestly enough that I let them sit on the porch between us. Some relatives vanished after the will because they had only been related to Mason's version of the truth. That hurt less than I expected. Losing people who only loved your silence is not the same as losing love. It is more like opening a window in a room you did not realize was full of smoke. On the first anniversary of Grandpa's funeral, I drove the antique truck to Maple Ridge Chapel. It rattled the whole way, and I laughed so hard at a stoplight that a woman in the next car smiled at me. I brought Grandpa's fishing hat back to the chapel and placed it on the same table beside his photograph. This time nobody moved it. This time there was no envelope in Mason's hand. No performance. No announcement. Just memory. I used to think silence meant swallowing pain until it disappeared. Grandpa taught me something harder. Silence can also mean refusing to hand your truth to people who only want to use it against you. It can mean waiting until the facts have chairs, names, dates, and witnesses. It can mean letting a liar speak long enough that everyone finally hears the shape of the lie without you having to scream. Family is not proven by who stands closest to the casket. It is not proven by who says fairness the loudest, or who posts the best photograph, or who knows how to turn grief into a stage. Family is proven in the quiet parts. The medicine sorted at midnight. The gas tank emptied on back roads. The hand held when nobody else wants the work. The truth kept safe because someday someone might need it. I still carry the brass key on my ring. It does not open the blue lockbox anymore. That box sits empty on my bookshelf. But I keep the key because it reminds me of the day Mason thought my silence meant I had nothing. He announced I had been cut out of Grandpa's will at the funeral. Then the second envelope opened, and everyone learned the truth. I was not silent because I was guilty. I was silent because Grandpa had already given the truth a key.